for he was sending off parties of recruits to join one of the big corps d'armée in the neighborhood, and they all passed at the chateau to get their money and a feuille de route, which was signed by him. He sent them off in small bands of 4 or 5, always through the woods, with a line to various keepers and farmers along the route, whom could be trusted, and would help them to get on and find their way. Of course, if any one of them had been taken with W's signature and recommendation on him, the Germans would have made short work of W, which he was quite aware of. So every night for weeks his big black Irish horse, Paddy, was saddled and tied to a certain tree in one of the narrow alleys of the big park, the branches so thick and low that it was difficult to pass in broad daylight, and at night impossible, except for him who knew every inch of the ground. Within 5 minutes' start, if the alarm had been given, he could have got away into his own woods where he knew no one would follow him. Hubert, the old coachman, used often to talk to me about all that troubled time. When the weather was dark and stormy, he used to stay to himself half the night, starting at every sound, and there are so many sounds in the woods at night, all sorts of wild birds and little animals that one never hears in the daytime. Sometimes a rabbit would dart out of a hole and whisk round a corner. Sometimes a big buse, sort of eagle, would fly out of a tree with great flapping of wings. Occasionally a wild cat with bright green eyes would come stealthily along and then make a flying leap over the bushes. His nerves were so unstrung that every noise seemed a danger, and he had visions of Germans lying in ambush in the woods, waiting to pounce upon W if he should appear. He said Paddy was so wise, seemed to know that he must be perfectly quiet, never kicked nor snorted. It was impossible to realize those dreadful days when we were riding and walking in the woods, so enchanting in the early summer, with thousands of lilies of the valley and periwinkles growing wild, and a beautiful blue flower, a sort of orchid. We used to turn all the village children into the woods, and they picked enormous bunches of lilies, which stood all over the chateau and china bowls. I loved the wood life at all seasons. I often made the round with W and his keepers in the autumn when he was preparing a battue. The men were very keen about the game, knew the tracks of all the animals, showing me the long narrow rabbit tracks, running a long distance toward the quarries, which were full of rabbit holes, and the little delicate hoof marks of the chevreuil, roe deer, just where he had jumped across the road. The wild boar was easy to trace, little twigs broken and ferns and leaves quite crushed where he had passed. The wild boars and stags never stayed very long in our woods, went through merely to the forest of Villers-Cotterêts, so it was most important to know the exact moment of their passage, and there was great pride and excitement when one was taken. Another interesting moment was when the Coupe de l'Année was being made. Parts of the woods were cut down regularly every year, certain squares marked off. The first day's work was the marking of the big trees along the alleys which were to remain, a broad red ring around the trunks being very conspicuous. Then came the thinning of the trees, cutting off the top branches, and that was really a curious sight. The men climbed high into the tree, and then hung onto the trunk with iron clamps on their feet, with points which stuck into the bark and apparently gave them a perfectly secure hold. But it looked dangerous to see them swinging off from the trunk with a sort of axe in their hands, cutting off the branches with a swift, sharp stroke. When they finally attacked the big trees that were to come down, it was a much longer affair, and they made slow progress. They knew their work well, the exact moment when the last blow had been given, and they must spring aside to get out of the way when the tree fell with a great crash. There were usually 2 or 3 big battues in November for the neighboring farmers and small proprietors. The breakfast always took place at the keeper's house. We had arranged one room as a dining room, and the keeper's wife was a very good cook. Her omelette au lard and civet de lièvre, classic dishes for a shooting breakfast, were excellent. The repast always ended with a galette aux amandes, made by the chef of the chateau. I generally went down to the kennels at the end of the day, and it was a pretty sight when the party emerged from the woods, first the shooters, then a regiment of beaters, men who track the game cart with a donkey bringing up the rear, the big game chevreuil, or boar, at the bottom of the cart, the hares and rabbits hanging from the sides. The sportsmen all came back to the keeper's lodge to have a drink before starting off on their long drive home, and there was always a great discussion over the entries in the game book and the number of pieces each man had killed. It was a very difficult account to make, as every man counted many more rabbits.